grabbed hold of the toilet handle and flushed, only it didn't flush. It exploded. The entire toilet shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces of porcelain.
Hell no.
Each one.
What it is, guys? It's your boy BlastphamousHD, and today we are here to check out a video you guys sent to me in the DMs of the Discord. Dumb ways to die. More at 11.
I've never been skiing because when someone says vacation, I think of warm, sunny beaches, not freezing my tushy off on a mountain. And I recently saw a horrifying video that only put me off further. Back in April 2022, an experienced skier was hitting the slopes in the French Alps when this happened.
Oh le con!
Whoa. The man plummeted straight through the ice into a deep crevasse and dropped down a terrifying 49 feet before managing to wedge his skis in and scrape to a stop on a thin ledge. Ooh, I'm getting chills just looking at that. Thanks to a heap of luck and a skilled team of fellow skiers, this guy was pulled out of the icy hellhole by a rope and pulley. But the whole process took hours. He wasn't alone in his traumatic experience either. Because 2022 was warmer than usual, more people took to the slopes and crevasse falls rose drastically from around 38 a year to 70. Sadly, 6 of those 70 never made it back out, which makes our boy's incredible escape that much more impressive. That's a whole load of nopes to the slopes from me. A rough commute. A daily commute into work can be long, cramped, and boring. In April 2022, however, one commuter ended up in a situation so terrifying you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. The woman was waiting for a train at a station in Buenos Aires, Argentina, when she suddenly started feeling lightheaded. People around her watched in horror as she stumbled forward and fell over straight into the path of the moving train. Surely, that was the end of her. It certainly looked like it. The woman didn't just hit the moving carriage, she disappeared beneath it entirely. The train screeched to a halt and a huge crowd gathered around the spot where she'd fallen, but there was no sign of her. That is, until they heard somebody calling for help. What? She was alive? Unbelievably, the woman had slid mere inches beneath the carriage as they raced above her, and was pressed to the side of the platform edge. Just a moment later, and she'd have been a human smoothie. Astonished, the witnesses pulled her back out, and were even more astonished to see she was mostly unharmed. After going to the hospital, the doctors told her she'd experienced a freak drop in blood pressure, which had led to the fall. But after just a couple of days, she was right as rain again. Or should I say, right as train. I'll see myself out.
That's a good one.
Between falling down a crevasse and falling down beside a moving train, which fall did you think was scarier? For the crevasse, hit that like button, and for the train, hit subscribe.
Crevasse.
All done. Great. What weird and wild escape from fate have we got next? Rest in peace room. Okay, I'm not proud of it, but I've left my toilet in a state that would scare even Pennywise the clown. But it's never been dangerous. However, when 58-year-old New Yorker Michel Pierre went to the bathroom one fateful day in 2013, he couldn't have known the terror that was about to befall him. After finishing up, Michel grabbed hold of the toilet handle and flushed, only it didn't flush. It exploded. The entire toilet shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces of porcelain, each one shooting in a different direction like a giant poopy grenade. The shock of the blast sent Michel flying backwards into the opposite wall, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was lying in a pool of water and broken porcelain. Shocked, hurt, but thankfully very much alive, Michel called emergency services and was taken to hospital where he got 30 stitches and made a full recovery. Alright, so what the heck happened? Well, it wasn't an evil toilet clown. Turns out, water to the building had been shut off for plumbing work that day. Because of the work they were doing, when Michel flushed the toilet, it created a huge buildup of pressure in the pipe, which burst not only Michel's toilet, but 3 others in the building too. Man,
Dang.
I'm used to explosions in the restroom, but not ones that come from the toilet itself. Lumber whack. Trees are one of Earth's most precious resources, vital lifelines that pump oxygen into the air and keep us alive. They can also be incredibly dangerous. Something Canadian tree feller Jeremy Cobalt found out the hard way back in 2017. Jeremy was sawing a particularly big tree down when he suddenly heard a loud cracking sound.
Thunder? Run, bitch!
Cripes. One wrong move and they'd have needed a spatula to peel him off the floor. It looks like the base of the tree was rotten, something Jeremy didn't realize until he sawed deep into it. Because of the rot, the trunk was weak and split vertically up the middle, something called a barber chair, after the old barber chairs that used to position a person's head back and feet up. By sheer chance, our boy jumped the right way, though, and saved himself from a nasty demise. What tremendous luck. Chalksplosion. Ever since reading Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory when I was a kid, I've always loved the idea of working in one. Turns out, though, the reality is less oompa loompa doopity doo and more, oh geez, help, I'm gonna die. Or at least it was for Pennsylvanian chocolate factory worker Patricia Borge back in April 2023. It was an ordinary day at the factory, apart from one thing. There was a strange smell of gas in the air. Patricia reported it to her supervisor, but they just said someone higher up would deal with it. Big mistake. Just 30 minutes later, a huge explosion ripped through the factory and sent the whole place up in flames. The blast set Patricia alight. Panicking, she started to run, but the floor gave way beneath her and she plummeted into a huge vat of liquid chocolate in the basement. The liquid in the vat was only chest high, but it had extinguished the flames and broken her fall enough to save her life. However, she'd also broken her feet on impact and was far too short to climb out of the vat. She was trapped. Firefighters arrived to put out the flames, but they couldn't see Patricia or hear her cries for help. Water from their hoses gradually poured in from above, and Patricia managed to use the rising water level in the vat to climb out. Then she heaved herself over the edge, fell again, and fell in a waist-deep pool of water on the basement floor. Unable to walk, she clutched onto a bit of plastic tubing and screamed for help. Nobody came. Hours passed like this. However, just as she was giving up hope, a team of rescuers found her. Battered, freezing cold, and confused, Patricia was carried out of the factory and taken to hospital, where, thankfully, she's expected to make a full recovery. Whew!
Damn!
I don't know about Willy Wonka, but that was an absolutely bonkers story of survival. Blunder blade. Some people absolutely love DIY. Me, though, not a fan. And it's all because of videos like these. Yeah, so this guy was using something called an angle grinder, essentially a spinning blade used for cutting metal. If you think that sounds dangerous, you're completely right. Supposedly, halfway through using it, the blade broke, flew off, and got lodged in his hat. Holy moly. If that corduroy bucket hat hadn't been there, it would have gone straight into his head. Wait, would a bucket hat really stop a speeding blade? I mean, it's very unlikely, but possible, I suppose. But if we look at this shot here, we can see that he was using a tool with his right hand. When it switches to his face, it looks like the blade is in the right side of his hat. But look at the text on it. The image has been flipped. If we flip it back, we can see it's actually on his left side. I guess he could have been using it with his left hand, but if the blade sheared off mid-spin, would some fabric really have been enough to stop it? Really convenient, seeing as he's not wearing any other safety equipment. A little too convenient, if you ask me. Personally, I think this video's been staged for TikTok clout. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Resistance. The brain is a remarkable organ. Not only is it responsible for everything we do and feel, it can also keep working despite major injury. And back in 2016, one unfortunate 12-year-old girl from India found this out the hard and very gross way. She'd been suffering from seizures, headaches, and general weakness for over 2 years, but nobody knew why. Then her symptoms suddenly got so bad, she became paralyzed down the right side of her body and couldn't even feed herself. Her parents rushed her to hospital where she had an MRI scan, and doctors made a horrifying discovery. A tapeworm larva had been living inside a cyst in her head for almost 10 years.
What?
Ugh. Nita probably ate the larva when it was smaller in some contaminated food, then made its way to her brain and began growing there. The cyst had gotten so huge that it weighed over 1.5 pounds. It was so big, it was nearly the size of her entire brain. Oh, that is horrendous. Doctors were astonished. The giant growth could have ruptured at any point and ended her life instantly, but by some miracle, it hadn't. Because it was so close to her brain, though, it had caused a whole bunch of issues, which meant her paralysis endured. There was only one thing to it: surgery. Incredibly, after a 2.5-hour operation, the cyst was successfully removed intact, and Nita pulled through. 2 weeks later, all her symptoms had disappeared. Wow. Nita's now an ordinary girl again, enjoying life to its fullest. Driving near disasters.
That's what's up.
You're smart. You don't need me to tell you why driving can be dangerous, I hope. But there are far more risks to the road than you might imagine. Like, I don't know, trees randomly collapsing as you drive past. Cripes. A second earlier and that driver would have been a goner. Yep, nature can be a very cruel mistress. As one man from Kenya will testify, in May 2023, the Galana River flooded and rushed into his truck, overturning it and leaving him stranded amidst the rising waters for over 6 hours. Thankfully, the Sheldrick wild trucks come with their own set of risks, especially if you're driving behind them. In Florida, back in 2018, one woman was driving down Interstate 95 when a plywood sheet in the truck in front of her came loose and flew backwards, smashing straight through her windscreen. By sheer luck, the sheet didn't touch her, but it had gotten terrifyingly close to her neck. It's a miracle she managed to stop the vehicle before losing control. See, the truck driver hadn't tied down the sheet properly. And it's a problem plaguing more than just pickup drivers. TikToker Alo420 posted the following video after a similar accident happened while he was driving behind a log truck.
Easy, and with savings that fit right into her.
You're crazy, boy.
USAA.com.
Final destination.
USAA.
Yeah, literally.
That's a final destination.
So this is a general service announcement to anyone hauling anything on trucks. Double, triple, then quadruple check that your loads are secure. Hey, quintuple, sextuple, and septuple check it if you got time. I wouldn't even be mad at an octuple check. But even if you never drive behind another truck again, you could still end up in some sticky situations. One of my viewers was driving past a truck when the brake pad flew off the wheel and, you guessed it, hit their windscreen. They slammed on the brakes and thankfully the pad broke free without injuring anybody. But it just goes to show you can never be truly prepared. Something nobody knows more than Mauricio Henao from California. Mauricio was sitting parked below a hillside near his house when his girlfriend called him and told him to go back in their home to check something. Mauricio got out of the car and walked back into the house, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, there was a loud rumbling followed by an even louder crash. Shocked, Mauricio turned around and was horrified at what he saw. A huge rock was buried in the roof of his car, completely crushing it. It had fallen down the hill in a landslide, and if his girlfriend had called him just moments later, it would have smashed right into him.
Ooh.
Ugh. Talk about a rocky start to the day. A close shave. Sometimes I hear a story that stuns me as much as it makes my stomach churn. This is one of those stories. In a small Indian village in Uttar Pradesh, a young woman called Taiba went out for a walk. While wandering, she came across a construction site and, intrigued, decided to explore it. This, it turns out, was a very bad move. The place was littered with rocks and half-finished structures, and Taiba wasn't being super careful where she was looking. Suddenly, she tripped and landed neck first on a long metal rod that was protruding from a brick. Luckily, however, there were people nearby who saw the whole thing happen. They ran to get help, and it wasn't long before paramedics came to the shocking scene. But she needed to be taken to the hospital. When they got there, the doctors were gobsmacked. By some miracle, the rod had missed all of the vital nerves and blood vessels in her head. The docs got to work gradually pulling it out, and after 35 grueling minutes, it was over. Amazingly, Taiba survived and was discharged just 3 days later without any lasting consequences. Wow, my jaw just hit the floor. Luckily, there were no metal rods down there. A girl's best friend. Back in 2012, following an ordeal that's too shocking to discuss on YouTube without getting demonetized, a woman named Michalina Kazaprak found herself tied up and locked in darkness inside a cardboard box buried in the ground. Upon realizing the reality of her situation, trying to keep her breathing as shallow as possible to preserve oxygen, she began frantically thinking for a way to escape. Suddenly, she remembered. She was wearing her engagement ring. The diamond was set so that it stood out of the ring, which she could use as a very basic cutting tool. With a desperate determination, she started cutting away at the binds around her wrists and eventually managed to break through them. Now it was time for the box, but proved tougher than it looked. But after an enormous effort and countless punches and scratches, Michalina managed to punch through. Dirt fell down on her face and clothes, and with one final burst of strength, she smashed out of the hole and saw the sky again. There was no sweeter sight. Exhausted, but very much alive, she clambered out of the box, staggered to the road, and flagged down a motorist who called the police. The individual responsible for all this was arrested shortly afterwards and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Good riddance. A whole lot of strength, perseverance, and willpower got Michalina out of that hole. But if she didn't have her engagement ring, it could have been a very different story. I guess diamonds really are a girl's best friend. Cobalt out of there. As far as jobs go, history has shown that mining is one of the worst. Aside from the long hours and persistent danger, the conditions are unpleasant to say the least. Claustrophobic, damp, cold. It's akin to a tomb down there. But in some parts of the world, people are still forced to brave terrible conditions and go down into the mines to scrape a living, like cobalt miners in the Congo. Cobalt is an important metal used to make batteries, and the Congo has over 70% of the world's supply. In other words, it's big business. The problem is, mining operations are plagued with human rights issues, corruption, and poor safety standards. Back in March 2023, a group of miners were working underground when the worst thing possible happened. The mine collapsed on top of them. Trapped and pinned down in a tiny pitch-black cavern with the ceiling crumbling in by the second, things looked dire. This may sound like a nightmare, but it's a very real way many miners meet their end. Officially, more than 15,000 miners perish every year. But that number is likely much higher with all the undeclared accidents that occur. Some estimates put that figure closer to the hundreds of thousands. Those are not good odds. Luckily for our miners, there were other workers on the surface. They jumped heroically into action and started digging wildly at the ground with their hands. But there wasn't much time. The mine was in the side of a hill, and the collapse had destabilized the ground farther up, causing rocks to come hurtling down directly at the rescuers. Undeterred, they kept digging, and thanks to some deft dodging worthy of Muhammad Ali, they broke through without being hit. Amazingly, all 9 of the buried miners came bursting out of the occluded mine entrance one by one and were pulled to safety. Whew! Even so, I'd highly consider a career change.
Yeah.
Window pane. I love the feeling of flying. I adore it. Can't get enough of it. Some people, however, aren't so keen. And after I heard about British Airways Flight 5390, I can see why. It all started a couple of days before the airplane was due to take off. While performing scheduled maintenance, the shift manager realized the captain's side windscreen needed to be replaced. So he set to work doing so. Only he stupidly hadn't read the plane's instruction manual and used the wrong screws to screw it back in with, ones that were too narrow to hold the panes in. But after self-certifying his own work, the plane was cleared to fly. Oh boy. 2 days later, 81 passengers and 6 crew boarded the plane in Birmingham, UK, ready to travel to Malaga. Little did they know, they were about to have the most terrifying journey of their lives. Everything started out normally. 10 minutes after takeoff, the 2 co-pilots, Captain Lancaster and First Officer Alistair Atchison, were in the cockpit with their flight attendant, Nigel Ogden, while the cabin crew prepared for food service. Then, the plane hit 17,300 feet, and everything changed. At this altitude, the pressure difference between the outside and inside was too much for the poorly installed side window. The screws holding it in place popped off, and the entire pane flew off. Immediately, the whole plane erupted into chaos. The decompression tore the cockpit door off its hinges and slammed straight into the throttle levers, blocking them. Even worse, Captain Lancaster was pulled halfway out of the plane, where he remained pinned with his feet still inside, pushing against the control column.
Oh my God.
Ogden rushed to his aid and, luckily, grabbed hold of his legs just in time to stop him flying out. But that wasn't the only problem. Because Lancaster's feet were pushing against the control column, the autopilot disconnected and the plane plunged into a nosedive. And with the throttle levers blocked, Atchison couldn't do anything to stop it. The plane was shooting back down to Earth like a speeding bullet. Atchison desperately tried to radio in help, but wind was whipping so violently around the cabin that he couldn't hear anything. Suddenly, 2 more flight attendants fought their way into the cockpit and stamped on the door, breaking it in 2. The throttles were free. Then they rushed to aid Ogden, who by now was suffering from frostbite and struggling to hold on to the captain. With the controls free, Atchison managed to get the plane under control, but it looked like it was too late for Lancaster. The captain's body had slid round the side of the plane, and now he was face first against the window. His skin was gray and his eyes wide and unblinking, but they couldn't release him in case he was thrown into the engines, which would bring the plane down. Eventually, Atchison slowed the plane to a reasonable enough speed that he could attempt a landing. However, he was over Southampton, a city he was utterly unfamiliar with, relying purely on the guidance of an air traffic controller, and without his captain. Atchison pulled off what he thought impossible. He landed the plane. Not only that, but he landed it safely with all 81 passengers shaken but unharmed. Wow. The crew weren't so lucky, with injuries ranging from frostbite to a dislocated shoulder, but that's nowhere near as bad as it could have been. And then there was Captain Lancaster. He'd been pinned outside the plane amid brutal 370-mile-per-hour winds in freezing temperatures as cold as 1 degree Fahrenheit. Yet within just a few minutes of touchdown, he opened his eyes. Incredibly, against all odds, the man was alive.
The fuck?
After being rushed to hospital, he was treated for frostbite and bone fractures, then made a full recovery. The fact he survived is nothing short of a medical miracle. The whole incident sparked off a huge investigation and led to an overhaul in the way maintenance staff are trained. So don't worry, it should never happen again. Not that it put Lancaster off. Within just 5 months, he was back flying jets. Crikey, if I was him, I'd be keeping my 2 feet firmly on the ground. Low point. I can't think of many words more commonly associated with accidents than heavy and machinery. I also can't think of any accident as horrendous as the one I'm about to tell you about. Get ready, because this is intense. Back in 2008, 25-year-old factory worker Matthew Lowe was working beside a computer-controlled conveyor near Barnsley, UK, when his overalls got caught in the machinery. Before he could react, he was dragged back and pinned to the conveyor, which was rolling straight towards a tiny 5-inch gap in the machine. He panicked. There was nowhere else for his body to go, and his overalls were still firmly entangled. He'd be completely crushed. At the last second, he noticed a slightly bigger gap just below the tiny one and quickly pushed his head through it. But it was too late for the rest of him. You know a CD case? Imagine your entire body getting pulled through a hole the size of one. I can't imagine what that must have sounded like, let alone felt like. The machine chewed Matthew up like he was made of polystyrene and spat him out on the floor. His clothes were tattered and almost all the bones in his body were completely broken. Yet somehow he was still alive and even conscious. That's when the pain hit. He screamed. Some of his fellow workers rushed to his aid and called an ambulance. When the paramedics came, they couldn't believe Matthew was still breathing. He was a total mess. As carefully as they could, they put him on a stretcher and took him to a hospital. But the ordeal was far from over. The surgery required for such a serious case involved pinning his shattered bones back together piece by piece with metal rods. And I mean lots of metal rods. All in all, doctors had to perform 6 operations before Matthew was whole again. Miraculously, though, he pulled through, and 18 months later, he'd made a near full recovery.
Oh my God.
What? Yeah, incredibly,
Oh
he
my
escaped
God.
the ordeal with only some slight arm issues to show for it. Perhaps even more surprisingly, he went back to work with the same company.
Motherfucker.
Jeez. At the very least, I hope they didn't make him wear any overalls.
You pull me through a machine hole that breaks all my bones, I'm at least gonna need a raise after that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to comment, like, and or subscribe. It's your boy BlastphamousHD. Twizzlers.